Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist, pioneered the study of classical conditioning, a phenomenon he explained in his experiments with dogs. This concept describes how an originally neutral stimulus can be associated with a specific response through learning. In his research, Pavlov observed that dogs began to salivate not only at the sight of food, but also upon hearing sounds associated with its arrival, such as the ringing of a bell. Pavlov's experiment was one of the most influential investigations in behavioral psychology. Its main objective was to study the salivation of dogs in response to food, but during his research, Pavlov discovered something much more surprising. Dogs began to salivate not only when they saw food, but also when they heard food-related sounds, such as the sound of the experimenter's footsteps. This phenomenon led him to investigate how stimuli could be associated to produce a conditioned response. Phase 1, Unconditioned Stimulus and Unconditioned Response. Pavlov presented dogs with an unconditioned stimulus, food. Naturally, when the dogs received food, they began to salivate. The unconditioned response of dogs to food was salivation, a natural and involuntary response. Phase 2, Introduction of the neutral stimulus. Next, Pavlov began to present a neutral stimulus, a bell sound, before offering the food. This sound initially elicited no response in the dogs, as it was not associated with food. Phase 3, Repeated association. Pavlov repeated this process many times. Each time he rang the bell, he immediately offered food to the dogs. After several repetitions, the dogs began to associate the sound of the bell with food. Phase 4, Conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. Finally, Pavlov found that after several repetitions, the dogs began to salivate only at the sound of the bell, even if they were not offered food. The sound of the bell, which was originally a neutral stimulus, had become a conditioned stimulus, and salivation, which was originally an unconditioned response, became a conditioned response. Applications of classical conditioning. Classical conditioning has a wide range of applications in psychology and everyday life. From behavior modification to the treatment of phobias, this fundamental principle has been used to understand how humans and animals learn and respond to their environment. Pavlov observed that his learning principles were not only limited to dogs, but could be applied in a variety of contexts. One of the most prominent examples of this application is the treatment of phobias. In systematic desensitization therapy, the principle of classical conditioning is used to associate fear-causing stimuli with relaxing responses. The study of conditioned responses has applications not only for understanding animal behavior, but also for understanding how human habits and emotions can be modified through the association of stimuli. Advertising and marketing. Classical conditioning is also found in marketing and advertising techniques, where brands associate their products with pleasant stimuli to influence purchasing decisions. For example, in advertising, images or sounds that evoke positive feelings, such as a soft melody or an image of a happy family, are often used to make the consumer associate those feelings with the product or service being sold. John B. Watson, one of the most influential psychologists to adopt Pavlov's theories, used classical conditioning to develop marketing techniques during his time working in the advertising industry. Watson understood that by associating a product with a positive emotional response, consumers could develop a preference for that product. Psychology can help companies develop products that not only satisfy a need, but are also associated with positive emotional responses. In this sense, products can become symbols of comfort, safety, or happiness for consumers. The ability to associate these products with pleasant stimuli enables brands to generate an automatic purchase response, regardless of the quality of the product. Everyday habits and learning. Classical conditioning is also fundamental to habit development. In everyday life, sounds, smells, or even specific situations can trigger automatic responses. For example, the sound of a doorbell can make someone feel excited or anxious, depending on what is associated with the arrival of visitors. Similarly, the smell of coffee can evoke feelings of comfort and relaxation in those who enjoy the beverage. Human behavior, including habits, is determined by a process of conditioning. The repetition of associations, such as that between a sound or smell and an emotional response, leads to such responses becoming automatic, as natural as the organism's physiological responses. This automation of responses is the basis of the habits we form. Repeated stimuli that we associate with pleasant or negative experiences can become part of our routine without our having to consciously think about them. Development of interpersonal relationships. Classical conditioning also plays a fundamental role in how people develop interpersonal relationships. Family and romantic interactions are rife with conditioned emotional associations. For example, a mother's voice may be associated with feelings of security and comfort, while a partner's tone of voice may evoke emotional responses of affection or love. Emotion conditioning, such as linking a stimulus with a positive or negative emotional response, is fundamental to human relationships. How one person feels toward another may depend largely on past experiences and emotional associations formed with certain stimuli. Thus, a person's voice or touch may become a conditioned stimulus that evokes a deep emotional response. Phobias and negative response conditioning. In addition, classical conditioning may be behind the creation of phobias, as demonstrated by the famous Little Albert experiment conducted by Watson and his assistant Rosalie Rayner in 1920. In this study, a child was conditioned to fear a white rat by associating the animal with a loud, disturbing noise. This technique evidenced how a fear response can be conditioned through repetition of a stimulus unrelated to the original response. The creation of a phobia is not a phenomenon that comes out of nowhere, it is the result of an association between a neutral stimulus and an aversive stimulus. In this case, the child, who originally had no fear of the rat, developed a fear response after repetition of the association with the loud sound. This study demonstrates that even complex emotions such as fear can be induced by classical conditioning. This experiment highlights how classical conditioning is not only relevant to the creation of positive responses, but also to the development of negative emotional responses that can have a lasting impact on people. Applications of classical conditioning show us how emotions, such as fear, happiness or love, can be conditioned through repeated experiences, and how these associations influence our decision-making, from purchasing products to forming relationships. The ability to create and modify these emotional responses is a powerful tool used in both psychological therapy and marketing. However, it also raises important ethical questions about how external stimuli can be used to deliberately manipulate human behavior. In summary, classical conditioning is a deeply influential process that is present in our daily lives, affecting the way we learn, feel and act. Understanding this mechanism is not only essential for psychology, but also for any discipline that seeks to influence human behavior, from medicine to advertising, education to politics.